Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Both China and the United States, the two biggest economies in the world, recognize the importance of soft power, but they seem to have different views on how to develop and exercise it. What does it mean in today's global international context, and why is it so important? What's the relationship between culture and soft power? How should China view the further development and strengthening of its own influence on the international stage? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Professor Zhang Xudong from the Department of Comparative Literature of New York University. Before we get started, let's look at this background.
Soft power is the opposite of the hard power, which is military power. So soft power may includes the political power, economic power, cultural power, and also maybe something about the ideology.
The culture or the special nationalities of a country, something that is more invisible and subconscious.
I think it is about ideologies and culture, and its influence may come from any perspective of our life.
Weak. My first impression about Chinese soft power is it is not that strong. US soft power is more like a commercial soft power.
Calligraphy, traditional medicines, or paintings and cultures, etc. And for American, it reminds me of the Hollywood and some famous university like Harvard.
The Chinese soft power, I think it is a traditional culture. But if you ask me what is the soft power of America, I think it is about pop culture. For example, music and movie industry.
And maybe in the case of American culture, it's, Walt Disney or Hollywood. And also big companies like Coca-Cola. Well, I think there's this theory that China is becoming more powerful in the world, but the Americans pride themselves on having more soft power. So they say, well, China is not that important or powerful because we have all the soft power in the world, So I think that's basically true. But of course, the soft power of China is also growing.
The American ideal of their soft power, to me, is basically or fundamentally from Christianity. They want to be a very good example, a role model for all the other countries of the world. As the Chinese people view it, harmony, peace, I think is number one.
Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Zhang. It's been 2 decades since the concept of soft power was first introduced by someone called Joseph Nye, former head of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Now, in spite of the general cultural influence, what do we mean when we talk about soft power?
Well, if you look at the context in which the notion of soft power was initially raised, I would be tempted to say that even though it's called a soft power, the way it was raised refers us back to the age of a hard power thinking. In other words, the context of competition, the use of state power, the raw muscles, these are still the underpinning.
You mean soft power and hard power should be the two sides of the same coin?
No, that's not what I mean. I mean, the soft power on it, just look at its face value, it's an interesting concept. But I'm not sure the way it was raised there was any clean cut from this hard power thinking. It might be a mere extension of hard power thinking. If you just use so-called soft power to show who has more hard power, then we're not talking about soft power. We're just talking about how to mobilize all these tangible, intangible elements to win a war, to get on top in some kind of a global competition. I think that might be slightly misleading when we try to come to terms with the notion of soft power, which I think has some potential. It's interesting, but I wonder whether there are ways to nudge the discussion a little bit away from the traditional Cold War-ish kind of this hard power thinking. In other words, the notion of soft power might be tainted by this hard power thinking at its birth.
President Obama says real power actually means you get what you want without having to exert violence or without having to use force. What does he mean?
Well, I don't know the concrete context, but if Obama only meant something like our goal is to win no matter what, but if we could use this thing called the soft power to achieve our goal, all the better. Otherwise, we would use violence as a last resort. Does not even sound as interesting as the ancient Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu said, 不战而屈人之兵, right? Mm-hmm. The best strategy is to win a war without even fighting.
Today, when we describe the soft power of the United States, for example, sorry for always citing the United States as a role model, because I'm sorry, I don't know why, but these days many Chinese intellectuals and those who come back from the West tend to be obsessed with the institutions and values that the United States and other Western allies of Washington boast of in the post-Cold War era, in particular when we look at the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, which was described by late U.S. President Ronald Reagan as an evil empire. What are the values as opposed to the evil empire?
Ray, you don't have to be too harsh on yourselves. It's pretty natural to refer to the United States as the kind of a standard bearer of soft power. It does. The United States does possess by far the largest, most impressive soft power, and it's grounded on all these industrial, technological, institutional, even cultural. If we look at the ratio between hard power, industry, economy, technology, all that.
Military-industrial complex.
Yeah, on the one hand,
how we're created.
And we all understand that if you develop your economy and your technology, those real powers, your soft power does not grow proportionally, right? There's no direct linkage between the two. There's no equation. And talking about the ratio or the efficiency of hard power transforming into soft power, I doubt the United States is the most successful case. But nevertheless, U.S., given all its strength, overall strength, does generate a lot of soft power in terms of it's called the New World for a reason.
However, late U.S. President Ronald Reagan is described by Time magazine as the man who beat communism in the early 1990s. And it is this president of the United States who called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Having said this, according to a survey carried out by a London PR company and Facebook, in 2015, America took the lead in world soft power ranking, followed by the UK, Germany, Canada, and France. And China only ranks in 29th place. What do you make of this result? How would you compare the soft power of China and the United States generally?
Yeah, I'm not surprised to learn that China ranks only the 29th, pointing, but it's not really surprising. I think China is in transition. Ancient Chinese civilization commands respect almost universally, respect and admiration. But in China's modern history, it was laden with wars, famine, natural disaster, civil war, political movements, all that kind of economic underdevelopment. It's not necessarily the most attractive places. And the irony is, in my experience as an American scholar with Chinese background, once in a while I will run into American people who say something like, Mao's China, even though it was not politically appealing to us, nevertheless, we could see it as possessing some kind of idealism, equality, for instance, probably not necessarily as a reality, but as an ideal. We found that morally, culturally appealing. That was a form of soft power. And China, as it develops rapidly in the economic domain, is losing that kind of a moral cultural appeal. as we become richer and powerful. That's maybe a small case in point that in this transitional period, there's a lot of lack of coordination, chaos. Some people go so far as saying that China today possesses the worst of socialism and the worst of capitalism. Places like that is not some, where you expect a lot of soft power coming out of it. Another important point is that I don't think soft power can be produced in any organized, rational, or government-led fashion. I'm of the opinion that soft power could only be produced almost naturally in families, individuals, in their daily life, in a form of life of a society, which is something derived from this long tradition. And the accumulation of soft power takes a long time, and you cannot make a 5-year plan to produce more soft power. It doesn't work that way.
Americans are proud of their culture and political institution largely because of the alleged universal values, for example, rule of law, check and balance, proportional representation. That kind of political institutions have helped this country avoid domestic upheavals like what we had during the Cultural Revolution. But this is one perspective in examining the alleged soft power of the United States. But what do you think should be viewed as the most attractive aspect of Chinese soft power or Chinese culture that may appeal to the mind and heart of those who want to come here and live in China?
Commonsensically, at a superficial level, the Chinese appeal, I think we could all refer to some traditional value systems, filial piety, respect for others, harmony, these kind of things. But a more historical view, I think, would direct our attention to some of the value judgments or value systems that are qualitatively different from, let's say, the West-dominated modern world. For instance, the Chinese went to Africa in the 60s or 70s to build a railway, right?
Mm-hmm. In Tanzania and Zambia.
Exactly. Not exactly for the purpose of extracting natural resources, to colonizing the continent, to dominating the people, but rather for helping African people to gain some kind of economic autonomy, independence. It's not pure propaganda. I think to some extent it was real. If China historically, in the recent past, could do something like that, it would just increase China's soft power, no question about it. Anything apart from the conventional colonialism would increase China's soft power because it's an alternative. It possesses some kind of ideal. It shows a different kind of a value system. I mean, that would be an ideal form of achieving soft power rather than generating more kind of a panda icons, just a pure culturalist approach, I think, could only go so far. You need to do something in terms that addresses today's the need of today's societies all over the world.
The soft power of China and the United States is very different from one another. Let's look at the film industries of the two countries. And as an example, in recent years, Hollywood films are adding more and more Chinese elements, such as Kung Fu Panda, Mission Impossible 3, and the new documentary film Born in China, directed by Lu Chuan. However, when we were talking about the Chinese films, the global audience tend to think of martial arts film only, by Jack Lee, Bruce Lee, so on and so forth. Why do we have this very narrow understanding by Western audiences about Chinese culture, only martial arts?
Yeah.
Is that the stereotyped perception?
And the panda bear and all that, I think it's a pity. But the answer could be very simple, because it's Western market's choice. It's not Chinese choice. It's something kind of happened to take place in the cultural market, in the cultural industry, which has its own taste. Similarly, I'm tempted to say that as China tries very, very hard to produce more stories, narratives, images of China to export, to enhance China's profile globally, I think there's a tendency, there's a risk rather, at imposing these kind of self-understandings on others, like feeding others with Chinese stories, Chinese experiences, Chinese dreams, Chinese ways. I don't think it's going to be very effective. I think the effective communication exchange should be based on people's choice rather than something superimposed on them by others.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Zhang Xudong with the Department of Comparative Literature of New York University. We're discussing the broad appeal of soft power and the context of its cultural diversity. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, Xudong. Many people, despite the new normal and the slowdown of the Chinese economy, many in the West are trying to figure out the driving force and catalyst behind the rapid expansion of the Chinese economy since the late 1970s, namely our opening up. And Chinese scholars with more confidence start to argue our soft power concerning, for example, diligence of Chinese workers along the assembly line and our entrepreneurship that came along with our Chinese culture may have done a lot to the success of the Chinese economy, and likewise in other small countries on the periphery who may have been patronized by the pervasive influence of Confucianism or New Confucianism, so to speak. So what do you think of the relationship between China's soft power and the rise of the Chinese economy?
Yeah, well, you cannot say these two things are absolutely separated, but I'm of the opinion, it's a minority opinion, I admit, that there's no direct link between the two. My personal opinion is that...
For example, Xudong, let me give you one perspective to illuminate the difficulty and perplexity of this issue. China is always described by Western media as an autocracy as opposed to democracy. What they mean by autocracy is actually concentration of a power, if not personality cult. That's what we practiced during the Cultural Revolution. And it means high effectiveness and efficiency in allocating social resources to get the job done. It's not exactly what we did like planning or central planning. It's a mixture of both central planning and the market-oriented economy. It's a mixture of private sector and SOE. It's a lot which make China very different from the liberal market economy in Europe and in the United States.
True, but China is not alone. It's not unique in a sense. Look at Imperial Russia, look at Imperial Germany, look at Imperial Japan, look at post-war Korea, Taiwan, the Asian tigers, so to speak. There's a pattern of authoritarian government sort of ushering in an era of spectacular economic growth. So China might not be that different. In
strongmen like Pinochet of Chile and President Suharto engineered their own economic success in what we call the style of a strongman leadership.
But not as long-lasting or nearly as successful.
But they ushered in periods of economic prosperity,
but
respectively.
I think at a stage of catching up, I think a centralized economy might be more efficient in allocating resources, putting emphasis on strategic technological development, which requires a lot of investment, national savings, and so on and so forth. And also safeguarding national sovereignty in order to protect national markets. Otherwise, it would be overwhelmed by much developed economies in the world. These are some commonsensical, or these are still subject of intense academic debates. We don't have to go too deep into that. But coming back to the issue of soft power, I don't think sheer economic success or even the sort of cultural reasons why your economy has been doing well wouldn't necessarily translate into soft power. People in the world may admire China's economic achievement in the past decades, but they might not necessarily admire the kind of way of life. Too hardworking, your environment suffers a lot, and too much teamwork, for instance, too hierarchical. If that's the case, I'm not sure that's the case, but I could imagine that your economic accomplishment does not necessarily transform into the kind of appeal or admiration you wish to command from
exactly. Many Westerners would marvel at the economic miracles, but they don't like the way that the economy is run in China, for example, through hierarchical order, rule by decree, and the sacrifice of labor rights, despite the recent approval of labor rights to protect the income of the vulnerable social groups. But that's pretty controversial. Resident representative of the Korean Bank, he said to me over dinner quite a few years ago, Ray, don't learn from South Korea, where the trade union played such a powerful role in raising the salary and in protecting the labor rights of the ordinary workers, that the competitive edge of the Korean economy had been seriously undermined as a result. So what do you think of the Oriental appeal of collectivism as opposed to individual liberty that has been emphasized so much by the American and the European constitutions?
I think it's a false
institutions.
It's a false opposition. But even before that, I want to say that might not be an accurate frame of a reference in which we can examine China's recent the social development. I think within the context of so-called Oriental culture, China, partly due to its socialist legacy, I think is doing a lot better in terms of gender equality, in terms of labor protection. There are many really heartbreaking individual cases, of course, but as a part of legacy, as a part of official mainstream institutional culture, I think as long as China remains even nominally socialist, labor issues, gender issues, basic social equality, those issues would still be front and center in on social consciousness. People could feel they have a right to raise these kind of issues. State legislatures, local governments, central governments, intellectuals, they do discuss these issues. And again, as a part of legacy, there are still remnants of socialist notions of workers' rights.
Excuse me, do we really practice socialism as in Scandinavian countries?
No, it's a very complicated issue. If you look at the real kind of actual levels of labor protection, labor rights, China might not be up to the level of those developed capitalist societies. But I'm talking about a kind of institutional culture, institutional memory even, and the kind of social ideals still shared by, reasonably by the majority of the nation's citizens. I think China may be described as a developing country with a social system slightly ahead of itself, ahead of its economic reality. So compared to economies at a similar stage of developments, China might be doing a lot better. And that may contribute to may address the question you raised earlier, why Chinese economy succeeded in the past decades. There are a lot of institutional reasons, and those reasons tend to be underappreciated, I think.
One renowned China hand in the United States described our way of modernization as using the pre-modern approach to push for modernization, and that will be the undoing of what we wanted to achieve. This is the note of his irony, but given the constraints of time on this edition of Dialogue Xudong, let's look at Japan. Which could also be viewed far and wide as a role model in navigating its own course of economic expansion. It's, after all, the third largest economy, which was only surpassed a few years ago by China, causing a lot of psychological contradictions in the island nation of Japan. Having said that, Japan is said to be a very good example in combining charm and appeal of Oriental culture with Western institutions. With the end of the Second World War, and General MacArthur occupied not only this nation but introduced successfully Western institutions to set up a check and balance in parliamentary politics one way or another. What do you think of the inspirations that we might as well draw from our neighboring country of Japan?
I think Japan's case is very, very different. It's a unique case. The kind of combination of a traditional culture, it's good preservation on the one hand, and a spectacular economic technological advancement on the other. Those are obvious. But that, for me, is not enough to regard Japan as a shining example of generating soft power. I think soft power eventually brings us to this issue. That is whether or not we want to live like that, whether their form of life is appealing to us at a fundamental level. I think American soft power sooner or later will touch the issue of American dream, of the land of promise, our land of opportunity, the new world, and what it is to be human, the ultimate frontier of humanity, our ultimate possibilities. Those kind of things are laid at the heart of American soft power.
But don't you think there is still glass ceiling? And American said in many of the rallies, black lives also matter.
Absolutely.
Following
There's
the police violence.
Profound divide within the American society.
By the way, when I cited Japan as one of the options in illuminating the issue of soft power, the ability to combine Western institutions with the Oriental culture, many Chinese here never underestimate the structural contradictions that pervade that national history or their way of perceiving their own history. For example, they refuse to apologize over the wartime atrocities. Now, what do you think of Singaporean model?
I don't want
to. He's a controversial guy. He's a lawyer by training in Oxford, but he refused to adopt exactly the same Western institutions like check and balance.
I visited Singapore. I did admire its economic achievement, its independence in a very difficult geopolitical situation, lack of natural resources and also. But I have to say, I found it even less appealing than the Japanese model as a kind of something that defines human freedom or human achievement. Going back to Japan, partly due to its relative rigid kind of institutional culture, you can only go so much if you rely on these traditional images or conventions. That, when we talk about Japan, we think of the kimono, the Fuji Mountain, that sort of thing, Kyoto. Of course, these are very, very appealing. But ultimately, I think that the Chinese I've spoken of, I've talked to, usually would say, and Americans for that matter, have the same response. They see more similarity between China and the States. These are big countries, people move around, enjoy a certain kind of freedom, without necessarily want to impose on themselves a lot of internalized external authority. I think these kind of things have more to do with soft power rather than the obvious achievements and the cultural imagery on the surface.
Thank you very much, Xu Dong, for your very meaningful participation and insightful comments on soft power. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.